Hello everyone. I'm Chris McMasters and I am so happy you're here today for our box lunch talk. We've got a real treat for you. Graybeal will be joining the stage in just a second or two. I want to mention to you that this talk will be recorded on Facebook Live. So if you have friends who can't get out, if they click into Facebook, they will see this talk. We're also going to host it on our YouTube channel, so if there's someone who wants to catch up, they can do that on our YouTube channel. And just to let you know what kind of free content we already have online, on Facebook Live you can look up last week's full week of Railroad Week programming. For 5 days we had programming at 7 o'clock every day of the week. All about railroads, all about the region with the new group that we're part of called the History Consortium. So that's all on our Facebook. And then on November 1st, you could have seen John Atta. He's recorded on Facebook as well. And he did a great talk about the original Thanksgiving dinner. He did a wonderful overview. So if you have a little time and you want to watch some free programming, look at our Facebook and you'll be able to see that. So now we're creating new programming. We've got Graybeal here. He's the collections chair and a trustee with the Historical Society. He was a former Historical Society executive director, and today he is chief curator at the Army Heritage Museum of the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle. His studies in Cooperstown graduate program earned him a master's degree in museum studies, and the State University of New York College in Oneida, is that close? His awards include the Army Achievement Medal for Civilian Service, the Army Commander's Award for Civilian Service, the Governor's Citation for Public Service, and a Certificate of Excellence from the Maryland Secretary of Housing and Community Development. He's so awarded, I don't think he could wear all those medals. Just too heavy. Jay is a past executive board member of the Maryland Association of History Museums and a Greater Westminster Development Corporation. He's our former director of the Tourism Council for Carroll County and the Community Media Center for Carroll County. He's a former grant reviewer and panelist for the Maryland Cultural and Historical Museums Assistance Program. So Jay comes to us highly qualified, and I'd like you to welcome him with a round of applause.
Thanks for that wonderful introduction. I need to cut that down and not give you so much information. We'll get on to the fun stuff. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back in person as we slowly come out of this pandemic. It's really nice to speak in person. The last time I spoke at the Historical Society, I guess it was a Zoom call, and the IT being the IT, it's always a little challenging, so it's really nice to be here in person, see a lot of old friends. Before I get started, I wanted to explain a little bit about this rather stuffy sounding title, put this in context. This was a talk I gave at a conference in September 2019 in Kyoto, Japan. I have a little introduction about that conference, and then I'm going to give pretty much the same paper that I did there with some insertions of some Carroll County people to make it local to our group. And also wanted to say that since we're talking about the Great War, World War I, that ended in 1918. Will be covering my book. Thanks to the IT people for the IT support today. This is a book I did in 1993 when I was working at the Historical Society. Tried to collect all the information we could on all of the veterans from Carroll County. There were about 1,200 who served. So when I was looking for a topic for this talk, the World War I centennial had just ended. I was appointed to the Governor's Commission for World War I, and we did some work around the state to try to help people understand the contributions of the service people in the Great War. One of the legacies of that is Veterans Day, which we celebrated last week. So I'd like to recognize all of our veterans who are here today. I know a couple. See my dad sitting in the front row. Can we have all the veterans raise your hand or stand up? Let's give a round of applause. Thank you for your service. So as I said, I did this book in 1993, and then when the 100th anniversary came around, it was right to take a new look at that topic. So this is the sign that greeted me every day when I entered the International Council of Museums annual meeting in 2019. And this was held at the Kyoto International Convention Center. Fascinating building. There were about 4,000 delegates from over 100 countries. I got to meet some of them, and I'll share a story about one of the nice people I met a little later in the talk. You look at this picture, it's not very good quality, is it? I took it off the internet. We were not allowed to take pictures, but this was the Crown Prince of Japan came and gave a talk about museums. It was really fascinating to see. All of the cabinet ministers were there, and every time one of them came up to speak, they would bow to the Crown Prince and his wife, a very low and long bow. We all learned how to do that, so we got along well with the Japanese people. Very, very beautiful people, and a wonderful trip. And he gave a great talk about his interest in museums and interest in preserving them. And it was really a very fascinating talk. But I had to get a picture off the internet because I told everybody, put your cameras away, you're not allowed to take a picture. They locked the building down for about half an hour. He came, had his own, I guess the equivalent of the Secret Service, came in and escorted about. It was a very nice talk. One of the nice things about our group, the Arms and Military History Museums that I belong to, we did an off-site, and this is a exhibit of swordsmithing, something very central to the Japanese military culture. And this is all of the steps of making a sword. If I can use my pointer. They start at the end with a lump of iron, which they've made from iron ore, same as they've been doing for thousands of years. And it works its way all the way through to a blade. It's then covered in clay, and each of the swordsmiths had their own method of marking their blades. They would put them in this clay and put them back in the fire, and the clay shielded some of the steel from the heat, and it gives a pattern to the steel and an edge to the steel. So they took us through all of those steps. And I have a brief couple slides in, and we're going to see some historic swords. This is the temple, and swordsmithing and the Buddhist temples are very closely linked in Japanese culture. And we were allowed to go into the temple, I'd take our shoes off, go in, and we spent about a half an hour there while they basically blessed a fire that they were going to give to the sword master to then show us how they did swordsmithing. But we weren't allowed to take any photographs inside the building. So in this slide, the monk has presented the fire to the master. This is the monk here, and he has a charcoal fire set up, and they make the swords the same way they made them for about 2,000 years. So you see the swordsmith in the brown, he's carrying the fire back after they've lit the fire. Then these two young apprentices are hammering, and there's the master and then his son. This is the son. And you can see him indicating with a small hammer where he wants each one of these young men to strike it with these very large hammers. You'll see a little close-up of that in a moment. But he would put that down, tap it, and then they would hit it. And they were striking it back and forth. The way they made these blades, they stretch out that billet of steel, then they fold it over, and they hammer it again, and then they fold it over. And literally thousands of times, and that makes the blade so strong. It gives a really interesting grain to the steel, and very, very strong and doesn't break. This was my turn. They allowed some people from the audience, and I put my hand up, and I was the first one they selected to come up. So a lot of pressure standing in front of all your colleagues with this hammer. The head's about this long, and it's not like one of our, like a sledgehammer where it's in the center, it's offset. So it's about 2/3 of the way up the hammerhead. It's a very, very unusual head. So I hit it like 5 or 6 times, and it was heavy, it wore me out. And this is the most important slide. The master is smiling, and his son is smiling, because I didn't miss. We had one poor guy that was from, I won't say what country in the former Soviet Union, but he didn't understand what no. He thinks that's hit harder and miss more. He came after me. Okay, then we went to the Kyoto National Museum to following up our sword talk. And this is the curator of the sword collection. Oh, sorry, they did a special exhibition. I jumped ahead. The National Museum created a special exhibition for us, all the members of ICOM. These are things from the temples all over Japan. This was the funeral urns where when a body was cremated, they put the ashes in one of these urns and they were buried at these temples. And I didn't take a picture of one that was magnificent. It was about the size of a basketball. It was silver-plated, brass or bronze, and had an inscription that started off the top and went entirely around it, hand engraved all the way around. The history of this man's life. He'd been an ambassador to Japan in like 700 AD and had died in service, and they cremated and sent the remains home in this spherical urn, and it was dug up in one of these temples and then there for the exhibit. Lots of figures from the temples. They just had galleries full of these. And here's a close-up of one of the Buddhas. And you wonder how they moved. Some of these things are carved wood, gilt wood, and some of them were 6, 8, 10 feet high. They were massive pieces of sculpture, but they all moved them in safely into these galleries. It was really impressive to see galleries full of these. Now, my slide about these swords. This is the curator of the sword collection at the National Museum. And the young woman on the right, I guess his right here, that's how the interns dress at this museum for a program like this. She's in traditional Japanese dress. And they actually had a set that some people could try on, and one of the young women on the tour from England was able to, she was the only one small enough to squeeze into the costume. One of the things they do in their sword collection for maintenance is they clean the sword once a year. So this is actually a practicum on how to clean swords. So they have reproduction sword blades and a cleaning kit. They had about a dozen of them, and some of us who volunteered to learn how to do it. I'm unpacking my kit, and I'm going to clean the sword that's in the brown sleeve there. But I wanted to point out the gentleman who looks like he's asleep beside me. He probably was. I have a story to tell you about him later. Fascinating. He's an arms curator from England, and his name's Bob. And Bob, the most laid-back guy you've ever want to meet, but he's a brilliant scholar. Everywhere he went was a t-shirt, shorts, and flip-flops, and that's Bob. But Bob and I were hanging out together that day, and I'll explain that at the end of my talk. We had a lot of fun. So I'm taking out the sword blade, and I was taught that you always take the sword out with the blade facing up, because that's the cutting edge and you don't want to put any extra wear on that, so you put it on the back of the sword. So they taught us how to do that. And then to take the blade is in a scabbard, and in the handle there's a hole through it, and that's a little piece of bamboo, and that's the only thing that holds that sword from coming out and coming loose. So when you hold it, you hit your wrist, and that vibration would shake it loose, and then you could remove the blade. And then we use a special oil to clean the blade. And then you put the whole thing back together, and put the whole kit back together, and then the sword would go back. And it's in a wooden scabbard. In Japanese, it's called a resting scabbard, and it rests in there until the samurai would need it. Then they brought us to a downstairs room where they had an exhibit of all these national treasure swords, the most magnificent things. I just brought one picture of this one today. All right, now to our talk. This is a talk I gave to the International Committee. Each of the members of ICOM, the International Council of Museums, you belong to a subcommittee. So my museum belongs to the one on arms and military history. A much smaller group than what you saw, the 4,000 people. There are only about 65 of us from across the country, across the world. And that's the group I spoke to. Thinking about the Great War again, this is a conflict. Trench warfare is what we entered in 1917. The war had been a stalemate since 1914. So we enter the trenches. And the other thing you think of with the Great War is poison gas. And this gentleman here is ringing an alarm bell. Little audience participation. Do you think it's a real attack? Or is this just a drill? What do you think? It's a drill for sure, because look, he's got his gas mask carrier at the ready. He wore it right here on your chest, because if you needed it, you had to put it on within seconds. So clearly it's not a gas attack. This is a drill in training. At Camp Meade with the 115th Infantry train, the 29th Division, which had men from Carroll County as well. They had a sign up on their gas training building that said there's two kinds of men in a gas attack, the quick and the dead. And that was true. An awful thing. One of the things that has not been used, thankfully, much since the Great War, but it's used very heavily in that conflict. Many of the casualties were gas casualties. And unfortunately, there were long-lasting impacts. Many men carried that with them the rest of their sometimes short lives. So that's me at the talk. I had a young Japanese woman was assigned to be my assistant. She was a volunteer at the museum, and she took all the pictures for me. We didn't speak she spoke no English, so I wasn't sure what my camera was going to have on it when I got out, but she did a great job taking some pictures for me. So it was just a small room, about 65 of us. These are the first men who got drafted in World War I. About 1,200 men and women from Carroll County served in the Great War. And this is taken from the courthouse in September of 1917. These men went to Camp Meade. Many of them ended up in the 313th Infantry of the 79th Division. So today's talk is about these insignias. Where do they come from? We had no divisions that didn't exist in the Army when we joined World War I. We followed the British and French patterns and came up with our own design of the division, what it would be composed of. But there was no insignia at that time. The Army didn't wear anything as a shoulder patch or shoulder sleeve insignia at that time. So this is a little book that we have at the museum, and it was an Army officer who was somehow involved in selling insignias. And he had this book that he would show people, this is what we're selling. And everything is World War I except one. This is the first division from the Second World War time period, but all the rest of them are original insignia from World War I. So we're going to trace back, where does this insignia come from? What were these influences? Most of the insignias came from either the commanders, or they would sometimes have contests among the men. Submit a design. What do you think what would we wear? And it all starts with this fellow. Now, this is Major General Charles J. Bailey. He was commanding the 81st Division, and he'd been to France in December of 1917, and he saw the British wearing these cut pieces of cloth on their uniform. And he noticed how much the esprit de corps benefited from that, but also, after a battle, they could find everybody and reorganize themselves. It gave them identification. So he came home, and he said, I'm going to do this for my division. He had no authorization to do it, but he picked, I'll show you in a second, the South Carolina Wildcat to be his emblem, and he ordered 30,000 of them, and he gave them to the troops before they left Hoboken, New Jersey, and he said, don't put them on till we get over there. Well, some doughboys being doughboys, they sewed them on their uniform. They were proud of it already. Well, the commanding general at the port of embarkation saw it and wires the War Department, what's the authorization for these men wearing this patch? While he's waiting for a reply, Bailey and all the 81st go over to France. They got away. But he sent a message to Pershing, and they followed that up. But this is what he came up with. And when I was deciding how to do this talk and how to explain these things to an international audience, I said, this is really going to be hard to explain some of these things. So I decided I'd put a real picture of what the inspiration was next to the shoulder sleeve insignia, and that would hopefully translate in all the multiple languages that people were looking at my talk in Kyoto. So this is a South Carolina Wildcat. That was his inspiration. And one of the things they did, they used colored backgrounds for the different branch colors in the Army. So this one's orange, which is the Signal Corps' branch color. So if it would have been infantry, it would have been light blue, and so forth. Some of the divisions do that. We'll talk a little bit about some of the other divisions. The second in particular did that. But this would have been a soldier that belonged to the 306th Field Signal Battalion as part of the 81st Division. So here's our commander of the AAF. This is Blackjack Pershing. His AAF headquarters got this message from the War Department saying, what are these guys doing wearing this patch in the 81st Division? What's he up to? Well, he gets called on the carpet to Pershing's headquarters. He makes his case to Pershing, and Pershing sees the wisdom of it and authorizes the creation of shoulder sleeve insignia for all of the divisions in the AAF. And then there's a whole slew of unofficial ones to smaller organizations. We'll look at a couple of those today. So what I did is I broke down some of the insignias into what I'm calling the cultural influence. It's a little stuffy for an academic conference, but these are some things that have a Native American influence. Second Division has an Indian head. So the Indian head insignia was, it seems like I skipped the slide. That's the one I wanted, apologies. This is Cianina Redfeather, and she's with Major General John A. Lejeune. It's on 31st of December, 1918, New Year's Eve. And this is the original insignia, is painted on the staff car. You see an Indian head, and he's facing to the right. This is the original insignia of the 2nd Division. And on the back of this image, it talks about Cianina Redfeather. She was Creek Cherokee, was a pre-war professional Native American singer and entertainer, and she was overseas. She ends up being the first woman to reach France, and then the first woman to enter Germany with the Army of Occupation right after the war. So she wrote, she's congratulating General Lejeune for the high tribute it pays her race for using this Indian head insignia. There's John Lejeune after the war wearing the insignia, but the Indian head's facing the other direction. This is the insignia that he changed. So the first one had the Indian head facing to the right, now it's facing the other way. And the reason he did that is because he liked the way the Indian head looked on a $5 gold piece. So he had it changed. Generals do that. So he's a Marine Corps general, and you wonder what's a Marine Corps general doing with the Army? Well, half of the 2nd Division, one whole brigade, 2 regiments of infantry were United States Marine Corps, and the command was given to John Lejeune. So he commanded Army troops under Pershing. One of the things that the 2nd did that's unique is they came up with a series of colors and background shapes to designate everybody in a division. Can you imagine the poor supply guy who had to supply all this stuff? Yeah. It goes away after the war. They go with the black shield with the Indian head on it, and that's the insignia they still use today. But that was the headquarters unit. All these other colors go away after World War I. But it's something they were sorting out in the Great War, and you can see guys wore that with pride, because this is my shape, this is unique to my infantry regiment, or my engineers. Now I'm going to mix in some Carroll people. The people in Kyoto didn't get to see any of the Carroll-Canians, but this is Private First Class Charles H. Cooper from Hampstead, 51st Company of the 5th Marine Regiment, so he's half of that 4th Infantry Brigade in the 2nd Division. He was wounded by a machine gun bolt that tore right across his chest. And we know that because when his son donated this uniform that he's wearing right down to the hat, everything you see in the picture is in the Historical Society's collection, as well as his own uniform from his service during the Korean War. And we have papers from the Veterans Administration talking about how he had 10% disability or something from this machine gun wound that struck him across the chest. Another one with Native American influence. This is the 34th Division, and they were from 36th Division, Texas, Oklahoma Division. So the T on the Indian arrowhead is for T for Texas, and then the arrowhead is for the former Indian Territory, now the state of Oklahoma. And this is also from the Southwest. This is the 34th. They had a red bull skull on a southwestern or Mexican water vessel called Ala, and it's a little harder to see, but that's why having an object next to it. This is the shape. It's a round bottom, and then a neck, and then something they had seen out in Southwest. This may seem a little shocking for American troops. Remember, this is 1918, and this is a device it's used all over the world prior to its use in the 1930s in Nazi Germany. We were doing the quilt documentation about 25 years ago at the Historical Society. People could bring in a local quilt and show it to us. This one beautiful quilt came in and was covered with red swastikas. And the woman said, well, Mom made it in the 1920s. And I always wondered how it made it through World War II not being burned just gotten rid of, but it wasn't swastika. And I'm sure that one still resides happily in a family here in Carroll County. But this is the 350th Field Artillery, and then you can see it's a Hopi bracelet, Navajo bracelet, and it's a symbol of good luck in Navajo culture, and it translated as a whirling log. That's what it meant to them. But you see it all over the world. We were talking before the talk about the Lafayette Escadrille. There's a new movie out, Lynn was saying, and I said by chance the copy of the pin is in my collection of slides today. But this was a group of Americans who went over before America was in the war, and they joined and flew with the French. And they adopted this symbol as their squadron insignia. So it was painted on their aircraft for recognition and pride. Then these little metallic pins were pinned on the left breast above their wing badge. And that's another World War I tradition for the air service that doesn't continue much into the 1920s. But this is the Lafayette Escadrille. This is one's in the Smithsonian's collection at the Air and Space Museum. So I'll look at some other American motifs. This is one that they really got a chuckle out of in Japan. You all recognize this is the 13th Division, unlucky number. Unlucky, but that doesn't translate very well. So I was telling them that black cat crosses your path is unlucky, but if you put a horseshoe around it, that makes it lucky. And I asked them, can anybody think why the horseshoe is facing up? You all know, right? So luck doesn't run out. But, they did get a chuckle out of that, and they were telling me afterwards on a break of some of the kinds of symbols in their cultures that were similar to what we were doing here, but that made sense to a lot of guys. Now, the 13th Division was one of the few divisions that did not get overseas. They were still in training when the war ended in November 1918. Now, the Statue of Liberty. This is the 77th Division. This was a draft division from the state of New York. Obviously, Statue of Liberty is in New York. One of the things that when you read soldiers' letters, if they went out of the New York port of embarkation, a lot of them would see that Statue of Liberty as they went by. And I've read a number of letters or diaries where soldiers said, I wonder if we'll ever see that again. You know, they kind of, there goes America on the horizon as they went overseas to France. This is one of my favorite things for photography. This is an image of soldiers making the Statue of Liberty. It's not the 77th Division, but this was a group of men in Camp Dodge, Iowa, that were doing the Statue of Liberty. And there was a photographer, I really call him an artist, named Arthur Mole, and he created these all over the country. And then he made them into, this is a postcard that people would send home to their family. But I want to read some of the statistics. What he did, he had an 11 by 14 glass plate camera, and he mounted that an 80-foot tower, so he'd be standing 80 feet off the ground with all of these men down below who were going to help him set it up, not the ones who would be in the picture. But he would trace onto that glass plate what he wanted to see. And then with a megaphone, he would tell the people on the ground where to put these ropes to make the design. It takes 18,000 men are in this picture. It took like a whole day to set this thing up. 17 men wide at the base, but when you look at the torch, just the torch takes 12,000 men, and it's a half a mile away. Isn't that amazing? But he would do these, and there's a number of them of different American motifs, eagles, most of the shoulder sleeve insignia, like this is similar to our 77th Division. But he did those, and they make a postcard, and then people would send them home, and that's how he made a living during the war. Neat survival. All right, the Blue Ridge Mountains of the 80th Division. This is mostly troops from West Virginia, western state there, and the Blue Ridge meant a lot to them. So I was lucky to find a good, they troll around the internet, try and find open source images, and find one that had a little blue in it was just great. Now we have the 82nd Division. They were the All-Americans. And this is one that I put in here because it's Alvin York, Medal of Honor recipient there on the right. It's the no more American division than the All-Americans. And they were from people just drafted from all over the United States. It's not one that has a geographic location. Similar is the 3rd Army, which it means AO, is the Army of Occupation. And we had a number of Carroll County people. I put this one in just so we could have some nice Carroll County folks who served. But these are all the people that went to Germany after the war. The United States had a zone there to occupy, and they wore the shoulder sleeve insignia, the AO of the Army. And it's still worn today by 3rd Army. This is Marie Franklin, and she was born in Marston, 1887, joined the Army Nurse Corps and went overseas. And she served in England and France with a hospital unit. It was originally out of St. Louis, Missouri. A lot of hospitals would send like a whole unit over. And then these people would serve together. They'd served in stateside in a hospital together, and they'd serve as a evacuation or base hospital overseas. And she was with the Barnes Hospital unit from St. Louis. This is J. Leland Jordan, a name that should be familiar to a lot of people at the Historical Society. We have his collection. Fantastic local historian. He was editor of the Times newspaper, and he wrote a column called Time Flies. And Joe Getty and I worked at the Historical Society together. We started a column, and it was based and influenced and encouraged by what J. Leland Jordan had done, writing about local history. We have copies of all those at the Historical Society. But in the 1990s, we were inspired by J. Leland Jordan. He served with an ordnance unit and was in Koblenz, Germany after the war, and then came home and then went back to being a newspaper man. This is yeah, they push it too hard and it goes. So this is the 92nd Buffalo Division. I did skip another one. There it is. This is the 369th. You've heard of the Harlem Hellfighters from Harlem, New York. They used a rattlesnake as the emblem for them. The Army obviously was segregated as the country then. They were assigned to fight with the French 161st Division, and the French loved the African American soldiers. Now we go to the Buffalo Soldiers. Now, you've heard of the Buffalo Soldiers from the West. They did call them Buffalo Soldiers again in World War I. And this was their insignia. It was a black buffalo, obviously. And they wore that on their uniforms, but they never served together as an entire division. The 92nd was parceled out to the French, and they did not serve as a division like most of the other divisions in American Expeditionary Forces. Now, this is Ordnance Sergeant Moses Williams, Troop I, the 9th Cavalry. He's not from Carroll County, but I want to tell a story. I used this as an example when I was giving the talk originally. He was awarded a Medal of Honor for an action in New Mexico in 1881, and his citation read, "Rallied a detachment, skillfully conducted a running fight of 3 or 4 hours, and by his coolness, bravery, and unflinching devotion to duty, in standing by his commanding officer in an exposed position under heavy fire from a large party of Indians, saved the lives of at least 3 of his comrades." He was awarded Medal of Honor in 1881. This is Private John T. Harps. He served in Battery F of the 351st Field Artillery. Again, another unit that was separated. They did not serve as a division. They served with the French. He was born in McKinstry, was drafted in 1917, and served overseas from mid-1918 to 1919. 28th Division. That's our neighbors across the Mason-Dixon line. And to figure out how you explain what a keystone is to a foreign culture. But nice picture. Shows a keystone in an arch. And for masonry, the keystone is what holds the arch from falling down. But Pennsylvania was situated right in the middle of 13 colonies. And they felt that they were the keystone that held the North and the South together during the formation of our nation. So they used the keystone. Later on, this insignia gets a nickname of the Bloody Bucket because of their heavy casualties, mostly in World War II in the Hurtgen Forest, where they took terrible casualties. Now, a little closer to home, the 29th Division, the blue and the gray, is a traditional Korean symbol of good luck, but it was also used by Northern Pacific Railroad, I think, in black and red, and that may have been part of the influence for why it was selected. But the neat thing is these are troops from the North and the South, And the colors represent the colors of the uniforms of the Confederates and the Union troops from the Civil War. And these are two Civil War veterans who were made peace. They're sitting nicely together at the 75th anniversary in Gettysburg in 1938. And this bringing together of these Southern and Northern troops was really interesting in 1918. But they got along fabulously, they fought well, and we had a lot of Carroll County men who served in that unit. And one of which, this is Paul Weimert. Paul Weimert was in Company C of the 112th Machine Gun Battalion. Our company in the 1st Maryland was Company H, the 1st Maryland Infantry. They took those men out and they made them machine gunners, Company C of the 112th Machine Gun Battalion. And that's the same armory we have downtown. That was the home of the 1st Maryland after that. And Paul Weimert and his wife, Gladys, built the house I live in on Green Street. So Paul's always somebody neat to me. But what's interesting about it, you notice he's not showing us his shoulder patches. He's facing the other way. One of the things you notice in images, once the soldiers got their patches, mostly after the war, they start wearing them. The picture's usually this way. They wanted to show that insignia. Also, down on the cuff, there was a little chevron in gold, which showed one chevron for every 6 months of service overseas, and they were proud of that. If you were over there, you wore that on your sleeve. If you were wounded, you wore one for every wound on this side. There was no Purple Heart medal until 1932. If you were wounded, you could request a Purple Heart in 1932, which you had to ask for because the Army didn't know where you were. 79th Division is the National Army Division of Maryland troops. That picture I showed you in the beginning of all those men sitting in front of the courthouse, 1917, many of them ended up in the 79th Division and fought with them. So we have a couple images. This is Private First Class Jesse Anders. He was born in Uniontown and then enlisted from New Windsor. He served in Company D of the 311th Machine Gun Battalion. And I didn't mention it, but the machine gun is one of the other new weapons of the Great War. We talked about poison gas. You have the introduction of aircraft in combat, and also the tank, barbed wire, machine guns. Those kinds of things are unique or begin in that conflict. He served with the Machine Gun Battalion in 311. They would have been in support of the men in the 313th Infantry who were leading the advance. And if you look on his overseas cap, he's got that little cross of Lorraine, and that was where they were in France when they selected their insignia, the region of Lorraine, France. So that symbol, that double-barred cross, is meant everything to them because that's where they were in their service. This is Marion Blizzard, Private Company K of the 315th Infantry. He was born in Sandyville and enlisted from Westminster. He was slightly wounded on September 29, 1918. And what's interesting, when this picture came in to copy when I was at the Historical Society, I noticed a couple things. He's wearing an officer's cap. He's a private. But he really got dressed up for the photograph. He also has a collar insignia of crossed rifles. He's got his 79th Division patch as well. This is Harry Hunter. We're fortunate to have all of Harry Hunter's papers and his brother who served in the Navy at the Historical Society. It fills a full 5-inch archival box. And it's really the most complete collection of letters, and the draft knows everything we have for a soldier from Carroll County. And he was born in Westminster and then served overseas and fought in the Meuse-Argonne campaign. What does the hand look like? Does anybody look bloody? It's red. Yeah, this was an insignia that was proposed for the 93rd Division. It's African American troops. And they had fought with the French. The French loved them, and the French, this is their flag. Oh, sorry. Wrong pointer. The 157th Regiment, or Division, I think, Division, they used the bloody hand as their emblem. So when they applied for that to Pershing's headquarters, it was turned down. They wouldn't allow them to wear it. Some soldiers still wear it because the insignia exists, and you see some, but it was an unauthorized insignia. But it was disapproved. We have a lot of men in the 371st and 372nd Infantry Regiments, and this is the 372nd wanted to adopt that as their insignia, but it was disapproved. It's So the 93rd then selected this one, and they fought with the French, and this is the shape of the French Adrian helmet. You saw the guys in our helmets, kind of a flat. We copied the British style, the Brody pattern for our helmet, but they copied this blue helmet that the French wore, the Adrian pattern. They were equipped with French arms, and German intelligence even believed that they were African colonials. They didn't realize that they were Americans. And I found in the old Stars and Stripes, April 4th, 1919, a little description that says, a great deal of honest pride in the shoulder insignia that shows on its black background a blue French helmet as a memento of their very foreign service. So they both served in France, but then they served with the French, unlike most of the men in the AAF. They served with a foreign nation. This is Frank Butler in civilian dress, but he served in Company A of the 371st Infantry Regiment. He was born in Johnsville, but enlisted from New Windsor and fought in the Meuse-Argonne offensive and came home safe. Army Ambulance Service. The poster on the right is encouraging French Canadians to join the Army in World War I. And you see that's the famous cock of Verdun, fighting rooster, the French. And they adopted that for the ambulance service, this rooster, and that's what they wore on their uniform. And another out of the Stars and Stripes I found, with the other American soldiers in France wearing shoulder insignia, the ambulance service chose one for itself that symbolizes its attachment to the French. Its shoulder patch shows the cock of Verdun, the famous fighting rooster superimposed in white on a background of maroon, maroon being the color, the branch color of the medical corps. This is one that didn't go all together too well. These are the soldiers who were assigned to the District of Paris, and whoever came up with the insignia said, well, no, let's do the fleur-de-lis. That's real French. Well, that turned out to be the Bourbon kings who'd been overthrown, and some of the soldiers were accosted on the street for wearing this shoulder sleeve insignia that they were promoting the royalists, and some of them refused to wear it and they wore it home, but 3 silver fleur-de-lis was seen to be offensive to many of the French in Paris. Now we'll swivel to Great Britain, another big ally in World War I. This is the 2nd Army Corps, and the 2nd Army fought with the French. They were up in the northern part of the line and fought closely with the French, so the American Eagle and the British Lion became in one shoulder patch. So it's a linkage of those service together. This is one, the same insignia, but the same soldier who brought this one home and gave it to our museum also brought home a stenciled pattern. It shows how these were made. The embroidery was done over a pre-printed stenciled design, which gets covered up by the bullion, and then it's underneath that, but you can't see it on the pad. It was an amazing survival. For some reason, he must have thought it was really interesting, and he asked for one and brought it home with him. This is the Courier Service, also inspired by the British. You see on the Royal Arms, there's a greyhound, silver greyhound. The story goes that there was, in Henry VIII's time, when he had a courier to deliver an important message, he carried a little silver greyhound. And if he showed you that greyhound, you did everything under your power to assist him, because you know what Henry did to people he didn't like. Yeah, that could happen to you. So the silver greyhound, this was the Courier Service, so they adopted something from Henry VIII's time as their shoulder patch. The Postal Service wore the same insignia, but without the border around it, and usually just in cloth with white instead of the silver bullion in this Courier's example. Now we'll go to Russia. After Italy, sorry, we got one more in Italy. This is the 332nd Infantry Regiment, and this was the only regiment in the American Army that went to Italy to help our ally against the Austrians. And the commander was Colonel Williams, had a brilliant idea. None of his men liked it very much, but he dressed all of his various brigades of one infantry regiment in different outfits. And he marched them all over creation, all day long, everywhere. After the war, they found out that the Austrians thought that they were facing tens of thousands of Americans when there was only one single regiment. And they signed an armistice a week before the armistice was signed in Europe with the Germans. So this one officer, marching his men all over, made the best of this little band of men that he had. We have a diary of one of these soldiers at the office, and he writes in very earthy terms about how we march all the day long, and the canteen wore the skin off my backside. And complaining about this colonel that marched there, but it had a good purpose as a leader. This is the same insignia. It's probably the most beautiful insignia worn by the AAF in this bullion fabric for the line of St. Mark, which is the city of Venice. And the AAS means Army Ambulance Service. Usually it just says 332 because that was who most of the men in Italy were, with the 332nd Infantry. But there are a number of these, MTC for motor transport and so forth, all in that open Bible that, again, is part of the line of St. Mark of Venice. Now on to Russia. The polar bear. When I gave this talk, the curators and director from the Russian Federation Museum was, oh, Mother Russia. They really enjoyed seeing a Russian bear. But we sent forces to North Russia during the Russian Revolution to help the White Russians, and they went to Vladivostok, was in Siberia, and then this is the North Russian expedition, called the Polar Bears, and they were very proud of their service. Some of the poor men were in the Philippines in khaki uniforms when they got the orders to go from the tropics to Siberia. Imagine that. That was regular Army, the 27th and 31st Infantry Regiments. This is John Edmund Lee. This is a picture of the Historical Society's collection. And it took me a while to figure him out because he's a lieutenant, and I couldn't find him in the Maryland records quickly. But he served with something called the Russian Railway Service Corps. We sent an engineer unit to run and keep the rail line secure in North Russia, and he ends up over there. It wasn't until 1973 that the U.S. Court of Appeals decision granted these men veteran status. They were not considered, even though you look at him, he's wearing the U.S. Army officer's uniform, everything, and they thought they were in the Army, but it was not until 1973, and unfortunately many of them had already passed and never got their veterans benefits. Now, 33rd Division, this is influenced by the Philippines. An Illinois regiment during the Spanish-American War was having trouble with their things being taken by the locals, so someone came up with the idea to paint a yellow cross on everything. And the Moros, for whatever reason, didn't touch their stuff again. And when this unit went over, the 33rd Division adopted this somewhat old symbol from, say, 1900, generation before them, and they put it on all their insignia, all their equipment, and they made a shoulder patch out of it. Now we have one from Germany. This is the big red one, they still call them today. The story goes about this one is when they were casting about for an insignia, one of the soldiers took this red fabric. This is a German field blitzer, which is a soft cap that the Germans wore, kind of like our overseas cap. And he cut the red band off, and he cut out a big one, and he sewed it on his coat and said, "That's us." It's the story that they still tell in the division today. And nobody knows who he was, but the big red one started with the field blitzer band. Now some that come from what I call nature. Yay. Somebody saying yay? No, the 42nd? Okay, 42nd. The rainbow was selected. Douglas MacArthur was reported to have said that this unit would stretch across the whole country like a rainbow. It doesn't sound like Douglas MacArthur does, talking about rainbows, but they selected that. The 4th is particularly fun. 4 ivy leaves, and most of them don't have the Roman numeral. But I picked that one for the slide because what's the Roman numeral for? Say it. Ivy. Get it? Ivy? Real corny, but true. They were the 4th Division. That's a regular Army division. This was equally corny. the 27th, they picked the constellation Orion, and then the monogram of NY, because they're a New York National Guard unit. Wonder why they picked that. They're not under Orion, are they? Well, they really truly were under Orion. Because that's the general commanding, General Orion. You can't make this stuff up, it's true. All right, another Carroll County map. This is Hugh Latimer Elderdice Jr. He started out in the Maryland National Guard. Was with the local guys in the 29th Division. But then he showed great promise, went to Officer Candidate School, and trained with the artillery, was commissioned as second lieutenant of field artillery, and then served with Battery B in the 106th Field Artillery in the 27th Division. He's probably wearing the patch, but the image is cut off in our collection, but he probably wore that one. One of the really neat memoirs we have at the Archives of the Historical Society is his memoir, which he entitled World War I as Seen Through the Eyes of Hugh Latimer Elderdice Jr. It's a really neat, I reprinted it for the book that we published in 1993, so it's in there. And this is a picture of him, and in his memoir, when I was reading it, he was describing where he was and the picture, and he talks about this pair of boots he found. See, these big heavy boots are turned down. But this is Hugh Latimer Elderdice, and they're looking at a supply train going in. They're getting ready to plan a new place where their field artillery regiment was going to emplace. And he said, we were going to go down and take a look at this village, but the Germans started dropping 105 millimeter shells. We decided not to do it that day. We got out of the way. It was just too dangerous. But this is a Signal Corps picture that we have at Carlisle, and I was able to find that and match it up with his reminiscence, and there it is. Anybody hazard a guess what the critter there on the left is? It's a chameleon. And this was a camouflage unit. So of course you pick a chameleon to be the symbol of the 40th Engineers Regiment, which is a camouflage regiment. Now we have some that I call mythology. You all recognize a Mercury dime, the one on the right. Well, this was the emblem, the winged helmet, which was taken for the Motor Transport Corps. Trucks were a very new invention and used in World War I almost for the first time. They used some on the Mexican border, but we had a lot of truck units over there, and they would take supplies up to the front lines. You had a lot of rail units that would bring supplies up with the engineers. Most of these rails were engineers, and then the trucks were motor transport. So they later became Transportation Corps. So they picked Hermes, the Greek, that's Greek. In Roman, it's Mercury as a messenger of the gods. And then I think every soldier probably had a dime in his pocket. He would have recognized this. And one of my all-time favorites, this is the Railway Artillery Reserve. And this bird is called an ouzelfinch. It's a mythological bird. This is a later postcard I'll tell you about in a second. But the story of the ouzelfinch is that an officer in 1905 was leaving, and I emphasize leaving, the officers' club, and he saw a strange winged bird that couldn't fly. And then other people claimed to see this odd bird. Well, this becomes the symbol for the air defense artillery, still used today. So the coast artillery first, now air defense later. So this is a World War II postcard that you could buy at the PX at Fort Monroe, Virginia during World War II. And this is a description of the ouzelfinch. It says, this bird flies backwards in order to keep the dust out of his eyes, and he is so bashful that if he sees someone, he swallows himself. Pure silly. But you have to wonder, what did that guy see stepping out? He'd been in the officers' club for a while. But it's now part of the air defense artillery. You see them crushing like a Russian fighter or something in his mouth. They're very proud of the ouzelfinch. And I think one last one in mythology, maybe. Ah, yes. This one got a couple of chuckles when I was in Japan. The guy I told you about, Bob, I'll tell you a little story about Bob here in a moment, but I didn't realize Bob was a huge Godzilla fan. The next day he showed up after my lecture with a Godzilla t-shirt on. We had a great time. But I said, when am I ever going to get to use something unique to Japan? So the symbol of the tank corps, a new weapon, is a side view of the tank, which is here. And hard to see, but underneath are two fire-breathing dragons. So I said, I got to use a Japanese dragon when I'm in Japan. So we picked this one to represent the dragon. But Bob, when he saw the slide, he literally fell on the floor laughing. Literally. One of those people with a huge laugh, got a big kick out of it. So now a little story about Bob. Bob is probably the best dressed he's ever been in the black shirt here. No flip-flops probably today. But this is Bob Wisdom Savage. And as I said, Bob was a huge Godzilla fan. But this image shows him with the skeletal remains of Richard III. Did anybody follow that story? He was discovered in 2012 in a parking lot, under a parking lot. I have a slide of that. Anyway, he was the last king of the House of York. He was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field, August 22nd, 1485. This was the last battle, the War of the Roses. And there was a team that went looking for him. All kinds of rumors. His body was thrown in the river. He was buried unceremoniously. Well, they finally decided that he was buried at this Greyfriars Church, which was destroyed. But what Bob was called in to do, because he's an expert in European weapons of the time period, they used the skeletal remains to figure out how was he killed, what weapons were used, and maybe in what sequence and so forth. So Bob has some great stories of the detective work that went into figuring out how was he killed, down to there were a number of wounds he described as insult wounds after he was probably dead, maybe almost dead, but he had been essentially stripped and was over a horse, and as they were carrying him along, people were jabbing him, and they documented, I think, 12 different wounds, and then others that would be not documented if it just went into the flesh. But they spent a lot of time with him. So I had a really interesting time talking with Bob about all his work and how they did that. All because I put a Godzilla slide in my talk. You just never know where these things are going to lead. As you mentioned, this was found in a car park. This is the site of the former Greyfriars Church, which again was destroyed during Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. And anybody know the story about this? Some of you may have seen this. These are they're laying out where they're going to start excavating through the blacktop here. You see what's here? He was found almost directly under the R for reserved. The parking attendant became quite famous. He did this in 2000, painted the R on it. He said, I got so tired of making people move. That's a reserved spot. He finally one day had some white paint and he went out and put a big R on it so people would stop parking on it. But then when they found the body directly under Richard, directly under the R, he became a celebrity. I had to explain why. How did you know? Of course you didn't know. One last slide. So these are still enduring symbols in the Army. These are two from close after the war. The helmet with the keystone for the 28th Division. These were worn home. All the victory parades, Memorial Day parades, long after the men would wear these. It was very important to them. Didn't have to paint it on, but most of them wanted to paint it on and bring a helmet home. Oftentimes it's on the front. The 28th are unique. They're on both sides. Did not wear these in combat. These symbols almost all were created right at the end of the war, late October, early November, and then into December. And then the 29th Division Association team, that represented a veteran of the war, and 29th Division Association, of course, is still in play. All right, I think that brings us to the end. Questions? If anyone has any questions, I'll try to answer. You're welcome.
Actually, Jay, I have a question. Just a little one.
Oh, a little one.
So, this is so amazingly detailed. So, academic. What got you interested in this?
In the Great War, always been interested in the uniforms. And my first job at the museum was curator of uniforms, so I got to touch these every day as part of my job. My grandparents, that's their generation. So I grew up knowing World War I veterans. My grandfather didn't serve, but I knew of people that he would introduce me to when I was a little kid. These are World War I and World War II veterans. So I was very interested in military history, and just interested in their little works of art. And I never really researched them to this level until I was putting this talk together. Where's all this stuff come from? They all have a story, and it's kind of fascinating that what the American genius comes up with when they needed something to say, this is us.
I find it amazing you can even find all these stories.
Many of them are, units that still exist today, and there was an official approval process. So all of those papers we applied for and had it approved officially. The unofficial ones are much more difficult to track down, the smaller units. But some of them still exist, like the Big Red One. They still call themselves Big Red One. I've worked with a Vietnam veteran, and he said in the jungle in Vietnam where they carved a Big Red One on the side of the mountain. Just like that shoulder patch. It still means something to those service people. Yeah. So they document it. Yeah.
We got all the questions for everyone? Any last calls for Jay? No. If not, say, oh, wait.
How many patches do I have? I have hundreds. We have thousands. Yeah. We like them. Each one's a little bit of art.
Are they collectibles or people collect those?
They're very collectible. Unfortunately, at some point, people cut a lot of them off the coast because a lot of times that's all that survives in the soldiers' paper. Yes, sir. You wouldn't necessarily have company flags. Regimental flags, you have a U.S. color, and then the regimental flag. There was a pattern for all of those. They were issued. Lots of flags were presented by the local ladies, and they do sometimes, especially Confederate ones, differ greatly. But by this time, they're issuing all of that stuff to our troops. So there's very little of that flag, let's put it that way.
Randy's question was about, did they do similar things for the Civil War? I'm not sure the microphone could hear that.
I'm sorry. He was asking, did they do similar for the Civil War? With flags, no. In the Civil War, you didn't have a lot of handmade flags, especially in the southern states. But there's no shoulder and sleeve insignia. There's one, the 10th Legion had a big Roman numeral on a shield, Roman numeral 10, and that's similar. And there's a couple of farriers with horseshoes on their shoulders, but there's nothing like what happens in the Great War. Yeah, thank you. Yes, sir.
I asked a lot of different things from the First World War. My family was very involved in it. And I have several things that I came across that is really local here. First thing Camp Colt.
Right.
All right. We had I have a photograph of a replacement battalion that is out of Camp Colt. That was actually, it was secret. It was the first American tanker unit.
Right.
I have a picture.
One of the big, long, yard-long pictures. Yeah. They're out there because every guy who was in the picture could buy one if he wanted it, so there's a lot of yard-longs out there.
So I received that. My other part of it is my family was also aviators for the First World War, and also in fighting 69th Irish Brigade in World War I, which was the Rainbow.
Fantastic. He's talking about Camp Colt, which is in Gettysburg. Eisenhower trained there. That's why Eisenhower bought a farm after the war in Gettysburg, because he had such connection to that community. Yeah. Yes, sir. You got one more? Sure.
We did have a Marine. His name was Devil Dan Bailey.
Devil Dan Bailey. He's a famous Marine. Yeah.
You know Mr. Smith Christian?
Christmas. Sure.
Yeah.
Ken Smith Christmas is. He's a great guy. Ken Smith Christmas. Fantastic. That's a name I haven't heard in a while. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? Hearing none, I know Jay will talk with you afterwards.
Sure.
I think we all want to thank him again.
Thank you. Thanks for the IT support today. I appreciate that.
So we're so glad to be back here in person. Oh, it's so nice to be with a group of people. And if you want to be with us at the Historical Society, we have a couple more things coming up. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about our special plans for the holidays. So December 4th, from 1 to 4, we're having a special holiday open house. And there are several reasons why you might want to come and join us from 1 to 4 on Saturday, December 4th. One is that we got a new plaque for Mary Shellman, and we'll be unveiling that plaque. It's sort of our Christmas gift to the city of Westminster. Mary Shellman has gotten recognized on a women's trail about suffrage and voting. And she's probably the second plaque in the state of Maryland. So this is truly a national recognition of Mary Shellman's work, and we'll be unveiling that plaque then. Also, we'll be having some musical groups, a craft, some refreshments, so come join us for kicking off the holiday season. Lastly, our new executive director, Jason Alari, will be there to meet with you. He'll be starting in December, and so you'll get a chance to meet the new executive director, and I will be exiting as interim executive director. I'll just go back to being chair of the board. On December 11th, we're hosting a new partnership with Shepherd Staff. We're going to have a holiday house of worship tour where 13 churches are going to be opening up in their holiday finest, and you'll be able to go view those churches on a Saturday afternoon, December 11th, from 3 to 7. And then afterwards, it's going to be a terrific concert at the Westminster Methodist Church on Main Street. And this is just a fundraiser for both organizations. The churches are going to open up with all their Christmas finery, and you can talk to them a little bit about their architecture. There's some pretty famous architects that worked on churches in Carroll County, and it'll be mostly the northern tier. And we'll hope that we'll do this every other year as a little fundraiser in conjunction with the churches. So come join us. You can buy tickets with the Historical Society online or in person. And they're just going to be $15. So it's not a whole lot, but it helps us every dollar we can get. And of course then, our next BLT is going to be with one of our favorite lifers, lifetime members, Kevin Dayhoff. Kevin, put your hand up. If I slaughter your name, at least they'll know who to look for next month. So please come back and join us then. Thank you very much.